The winter of 1944 brought more than snow to the Polish countryside. It brought soldiers, searches, and a silence so heavy that even breathing felt dangerous. Maria pressed her back against the rough wooden wall of the stable loft, her 4-year-old daughter Anna trembling in her arms. Below them, 3 horses shuffled in their stalls, their warm breath creating small clouds in the freezing air. This hayloft had become their world, a space barely large enough to lie down in, hidden behind loose boards that Maria had carefully arranged to look untouched. It had been 6 weeks since they fled their village. 6 weeks since Maria watched the trucks roll in and take her neighbors away. She had seen the fear in old Mr. Kowalski's eyes as they dragged him from his shop. She had heard the screams of the Rosenbaum family as soldiers broke down their door. That night, Maria made a choice. She grabbed Anna, a small bag of bread and cheese, and ran into the darkness. The forest had sheltered them for 3 days before they found this abandoned estate, its main house burned to ash but its stable still standing. The horses had been there when they arrived, left behind like ghosts of a former life. A grey mare, a chestnut gelding, and a young bay that couldn't have been more than 2 years old. They were thin, neglected, but alive. Maria knew nothing about horses, but she knew they needed food and water to survive. More importantly, she realized that caring for them gave her a reason to be here, a cover story if anyone came asking questions. She established a routine with the precision of someone whose life depended on it. Before dawn, while darkness still cloaked the world, she would climb down from the loft and tend to the horses. She found old grain in sealed bins, discovered a well that still worked, and learned to muck out stalls with shaking hands. Anna stayed in the loft during these hours, quiet as a shadow, just as Maria had taught her. The child understood, in the way children in wartime learn to understand, that silence meant survival. During the day, they barely moved. Maria had created a small nest in the hay, arranging it so they could lie flat and peer through gaps in the floorboards at the stable below. She told Anna stories in whispers so soft they were barely sound at all. Stories about a magical kingdom where little girls could laugh out loud, where mothers didn't have to hide their children in barns, where horses pulled carriages to grand parties instead of standing forgotten in decaying stables. Anna never cried. That fact broke Maria's heart more than anything else. 4 years old, and her daughter had already learned that tears were a luxury they couldn't afford. The child would look up at her with those enormous dark eyes, eyes that had seen too much, and simply nod when Maria put a finger to her lips. Sometimes Maria wondered if Anna even remembered what her own voice sounded like. Food was their constant worry. The bread had lasted only days. Maria ventured out at night, stealing vegetables from frozen gardens, finding forgotten preserves in abandoned cellars. Once, she caught a rabbit in a snare made from wires she found in the stable. She had cried while preparing it, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of having meat to give her child. The horses became their unwitting guardians. Their presence made the stable seem occupied but not suspicious. Farmers passed by occasionally, and if they noticed the horses looked healthier than they had weeks before, they said nothing. Everyone had their own secrets to keep. Everyone was trying to survive. But Maria knew this couldn't last forever. Winter was deepening, and Anna was growing thinner despite the food Maria managed to find. The child needed warmth, proper nutrition, safety. The loft was no place for a growing girl, yet the world outside offered only danger. Every night, Maria held her daughter close and made the same impossible calculation: how long could they stay hidden, and what would happen when their luck ran out? She never imagined the horses themselves would be the ones to betray them. The sound of engines shattered the morning silence like glass breaking on stone. Maria's eyes snapped open, her hand instinctively covering Anna's mouth though the child hadn't made a sound. Below them, the horses stirred nervously, their hooves shifting in the straw. Through the gaps in the floorboards, Maria watched as 2 military trucks rumbled up the overgrown path to the estate, their tires crunching over frozen ground. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. This was it. This was the moment she had dreaded every second of every day since they arrived. She pulled Anna closer, feeling the rapid flutter of her daughter's heartbeat against her own body. The child's eyes were wide but dry, fixed on her mother's face with absolute trust that made Maria want to scream. The truck stopped near the burned remains of the main house. Doors slammed. Voices called out in German, harsh and efficient. Maria counted 6 soldiers, maybe 7. An officer stood apart from the others, surveying the property with the calculating gaze of someone assessing value. He was older than the rest, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that might have been kind in another life. The officer gestured toward the stable, and Maria's blood turned to ice. 2 soldiers broke away from the group and headed straight for the building. She could hear their boots on the frozen ground, getting closer with each second. Her mind raced through impossible scenarios. Could they run? No, there was nowhere to go. Could they fight? Absurd. She had nothing but her bare hands and a child to protect. Could they hide better, push further back into the hay? The loft was barely 10 feet deep. The stable door creaked open. The horses reacted immediately. The gray mare whinnied, a sound so loud in the enclosed space that Maria flinched. The chestnut stamped his feet. The young bay moved restlessly in his stall. Maria understood their anxiety. These animals hadn't seen strangers in weeks, and soldiers carried with them the scent of gun oil and violence that even horses could sense. One soldier walked down the center aisle between the stalls while the other remained by the door. The walking soldier spoke, his voice floating up to where Maria and Anna lay frozen. He was young, she realized, maybe 20 at most. He said something about the horses being in decent condition, surprisingly so for an abandoned property. His companion laughed and made a crude joke she didn't fully understand. The young soldier stopped at each stall, examining the horses with what seemed like genuine interest. When he reached the gray mare, he spoke to her softly, and the horse lowered her head to sniff his outstretched hand. Maria watched this small moment of gentleness and felt a flicker of something she couldn't name. Hope perhaps, or maybe just the recognition that even in the darkest times, some humanity survived. But then the officer entered the stable, and the atmosphere changed instantly. His presence filled the space with authority and danger. He walked with purpose, his boots clicking against the stone floor. He examined the stalls with sharp eyes, noting the relatively clean conditions, the grain bins that weren't quite empty, the water buckets that had been recently filled. Maria's stomach twisted. She had been too careful, too thorough. An abandoned stable should look abandoned. These horses should be dead or dying, not healthy and fed. Every kindness she had shown them, every hour she had spent keeping them alive, had created evidence of human presence. She had left a trail as clear as footprints in snow. The officer spoke to the young soldier, asking questions. How long had they been here? Days, the soldier guessed, maybe weeks based on how the horses looked. The officer nodded slowly, his eyes scanning every corner of the stable. Then he looked up. Maria stopped breathing. She pulled Anna so close the child disappeared into her coat. Through the tiny gap in the boards, she watched the officer's gaze sweep across the loft area. He couldn't see them, she told herself. The boards were arranged perfectly. The hay concealed them completely. But his eyes lingered, and in that moment, Maria understood what it meant to be prey. The officer said something to the soldiers, and they began to spread out, searching. One checked the tack room. Another examined the grain bins more closely. The young soldier who had been gentle with the mare now poked at the hay bales with his rifle, methodical and thorough. Each movement brought them closer to discovery. Anna trembled in Maria's arms, and Maria pressed her lips to her daughter's hair, breathing in the scent of her, memorizing it. If these were their last moments together, she wanted to remember everything. The weight of Anna's small body. The softness of her hair. The way she fit perfectly in the curve of Maria's arms, as if they had been designed to hold each other. The chestnut horse suddenly kicked at his stall door, the bang echoing through the stable. The soldiers jumped, and the officer barked out a command. They were getting nervous, Maria realized. Good. Nervous soldiers made mistakes. But nervous soldiers also shot first and asked questions later. The search continued with agonizing slowness. Maria tracked every movement through the floorboards, her muscles locked in position, barely daring to shift her weight. Anna had gone completely still in her arms, a terrifying stillness that reminded Maria of small animals playing dead when predators drew near. The child's survival instinct had sharpened to an unnatural edge over these weeks of hiding. The young soldier finished checking the hay bales on the ground level and moved toward the ladder leading to the loft. Maria's vision tunneled. She could see his hand reaching for the lowest rung, could hear the officer saying something about checking everywhere. This was the end. There was no way they could remain undiscovered once someone climbed up here. The loft was small, the hay insufficient to hide them from a proper search. But then the gray mare did something unexpected. She began to paw at her stall door, creating a rhythmic banging that demanded attention. The horse tossed her head and whinnied again, louder this time. The officer turned toward the sound, irritated. He snapped an order at the young soldier, who abandoned the ladder and went to calm the animal. Maria watched in amazement as the mare continued her performance. The horse seemed genuinely agitated now, moving restlessly in her stall, her ears pinned back. Was it possible the animal sensed the danger to the humans hiding above? Or was this simply the behavior of a nervous horse unused to so many strangers? Either way, the distraction bought them precious seconds. The officer checked his watch and made a decision. He called the soldiers back, apparently satisfied that the stable held nothing of interest beyond horses. They had other properties to search, other potential hiding places to investigate. The young soldier gave the mare one last pat before following his superior outside. But they didn't leave. Through the gaps in the boards, Maria watched them gather near the trucks, studying maps and discussing something she couldn't hear. The officer kept glancing back at the stable, his expression thoughtful. He suspected something. She could see it in the way he carried himself, in the questions he seemed to be asking his men. Then he pointed at the stable and gave an order that made Maria's heart sink. 2 soldiers would stay behind. They were to set up a temporary watch post here, to monitor the property for the next several days. If someone was using this stable, if partisans were hiding supplies here, if resistance fighters were operating in the area, the watchers would discover them. The main group departed in one truck, leaving 2 soldiers behind with supplies and equipment. Maria recognized one of them as the young man who had been gentle with the horses. The other was older, harder, with the weathered face of someone who had seen too much combat. They began setting up a camp in the remains of the main house, close enough to monitor the stable but far enough to have shelter from the wind. Anna's small hand found Maria's, and she squeezed it gently, a question in the gesture. Maria had no answers. They were trapped. With soldiers watching the property day and night, there was no way to tend the horses, no way to search for food, no way to leave their hiding spot without being seen. They would have to remain absolutely motionless in the loft, hoping the soldiers would eventually leave before thirst or hunger forced them to reveal themselves. The first day passed in excruciating silence. Maria and Anna lay in the hay, moving only when absolutely necessary, breathing as quietly as possible. Below them, the horses grew restless. Their feeding time had passed. Their water buckets were growing empty. The grey mare began to pace in her stall, and the young bay called out, a sound that cut through Maria like a knife. The young soldier appeared in the stable, drawn by the horses' distress. He checked their water and found the buckets low. He looked around, confused. Someone had been caring for these animals recently, that much was obvious. But who? And where were they now? He filled the water buckets from the well and searched for grain. He found the bins Maria had been using and gave each horse a small portion. His movements were careful, almost reverent. He spoke to them in German, words Maria didn't understand but whose tone was unmistakable. He liked horses. Perhaps he had worked with them before the war, before everything became about death and destruction. As he worked, he talked to his companion, who had come to lean against the stable door. The older soldier was less interested in the horses than in complaining about being left behind on watch duty. He wanted action, he said. He was tired of sitting around waiting for ghosts. The young soldier suggested that whoever had been caring for the horses might return, but the older man dismissed this. Probably just a local farmer helping out, he said. Nothing to do with resistance or fugitives. Night fell, bringing with it a cold so intense that Maria could see her breath in the loft. She wrapped her coat around Anna, then wrapped herself around both, trying to create warmth from nothing. The child was shivering, and Maria knew they couldn't survive many nights like this. The hay provided some insulation, but it wasn't enough against the deep freeze of a Polish winter. Below them, the horses settled into an uneasy rest. The stable was warmer than the outside air, but Maria could feel the cold seeping through every crack in the boards. She thought about the choices that had brought them here, about the impossibility of the situation they now faced. 2 days without food. Maybe one more day without water. That was all they had left. The second day brought no relief. Maria's lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and Anna's skin had taken on a grayish pallor that terrified her. The child barely moved now, conserved energy with the instinct of the dying. Maria knew they had perhaps 12 more hours before they would have no choice but to reveal themselves or perish in the loft. The horses were suffering too. The young soldier had fed and watered them the previous day, but he was a soldier, not a stable hand. He didn't know their needs the way Maria had learned them. The bay was particularly distressed, calling out intermittently in a way that made the soldiers curse and complain about the noise. Maria made her decision in the grey light of dawn on the 3rd day. She would wait until dark, then climb down and surrender herself to the soldiers. She would tell them Anna was sick, that they needed help, that she would accept whatever consequences came if they would just show mercy to a dying child. It was a desperate plan with almost no chance of success, but doing nothing meant watching her daughter fade away. She spent the day preparing Anna, whispering to her about what would happen, trying to explain in words a 4-year-old could understand why they had to leave their hiding place. The child listened with those 2 old eyes and nodded. She understood that they were out of options. She understood that survival now depended on the kindness of enemies. But fate intervened in a way Maria never anticipated. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, a commotion erupted outside the stable. Maria heard shouting, the sound of vehicles, and then gunfire in the distance. The two soldiers who had been watching the property ran toward the noise, grabbing their weapons and disappearing around the burned house. Maria's body moved before her mind could catch up. This was their chance, possibly their only chance. She gathered Anna into her arms, her daughter's weight shockingly light after days without food, and moved toward the ladder. Her legs nearly gave out when she tried to stand. 3 days of immobility had left her muscles weak and cramping. She forced herself to move, to climb down the ladder one agonizing rung at a time. The stable floor felt strange and solid beneath her feet. The horses turned to look at them, the gray mare snorting softly as if in recognition. Maria stumbled toward the door, but her body betrayed her. Dehydration and exhaustion caught up all at once, and she felt her knees buckle. She tried to hold Anna, tried to keep them both upright, but the world was spinning and her grip was failing. She collapsed just inside the stable door, managing to twist so that Anna landed on top of her rather than on the hard ground. The child cried out, the first real sound she had made in days, and the cry was so weak it barely qualified as a whisper. Maria tried to rise, tried to keep moving, but her body refused to obey. Everything went dark at the edges of her vision. When she opened her eyes again, she was staring up at her face. The young soldier had returned and was kneeling beside them, his rifle forgotten on the ground next to him. His expression was one of absolute shock. He called out something in German, and Maria heard running footsteps. The older soldier appeared, his weapon raised, his face hardening when he saw them. Maria pulled Anna closer, a futile protective gesture. She tried to speak, to beg, to explain, but her throat was too dry and the words wouldn't come. The young soldier was talking rapidly, urgently, to his companion. He touched Anna's forehead and shook his head. He looked at Maria with something that might have been pity or might have been anger. The older soldier made a decision. He lowered his weapon and barked an order. The young soldier ran to get water while his companion stood guard, his face unreadable. When the water came, Maria drank desperately, then helped Anna drink, supporting her daughter's head as the child took tiny sips. The young soldier brought bread from their supplies, and Maria had to force herself not to devour it all at once. She broke off small pieces for Anna, watching as her daughter chewed with agonizing slowness. Every second, she expected the soldiers to call for reinforcements, to drag them away, to end this unexpected mercy. But they didn't. Instead, the young soldier carried Anna to his makeshift camp while the older one kept his rifle pointed at Maria and gestured for her to walk ahead of him. They sat her down near a small fire, and she held Anna in her lap, both of them shaking from cold and shock and the surreal nature of what was happening. They were prisoners now, their fate uncertain, but at least they were warm. At least they had water. At least, for this moment, they were alive. The older soldier paced back and forth, arguing with his younger companion in harsh German that Maria couldn't fully understand. But she grasped enough. Words like orders and duty and report came through clearly. The younger man kept shaking his head, pointing at Anna, his voice rising with emotion. They were deciding what to do with their unexpected captives. Maria held Anna close and waited. There was nothing else she could do. Running was impossible in their weakened state. Begging might make things worse. She simply sat by the fire, absorbing its warmth, and prepared herself for whatever came next. She had kept her daughter alive for 6 weeks. If this was the end, at least they would face it together. The argument ended abruptly when the older soldier made a sharp gesture and walked away, disappearing into the gathering darkness. The young soldier watched him go, then turned to Maria. He said something in German, then tried again in broken Polish. His accent was thick, but she understood. He asked if they had been in the loft the whole time. She nodded. He asked about the horses, who had been caring for them. She nodded again. A strange expression crossed his face. Respect, maybe, or simply disbelief that anyone could survive 3 days motionless in a freezing loft with a small child. He brought more food, more water. He found a blanket and wrapped it around Anna's shoulders. Then he did something that shocked Maria to her core. He pulled a photograph from his pocket and showed it to her. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, smiled up from the faded image. She had blonde braids and missing front teeth and eyes full of joy. The soldier pointed to the picture, then to his chest. His daughter, Maria realized. He had a daughter back home in Germany, a child not much older than Anna. He spoke again, and this time Maria caught most of it. He couldn't report them. He wouldn't. But they couldn't stay here. The older soldier had gone to check on the disturbance they had heard earlier. When he returned, he would expect a decision to have been made. The young soldier had perhaps an hour to help them disappear. Maria's mind struggled to process this. Why would he risk himself for strangers? Why show mercy to people his country had labeled as enemies? But she knew why. She saw it in the way he looked at Anna, in the photograph he still held. He saw his own daughter in this frightened child, and he couldn't bear to be the instrument of her destruction. He helped Maria to her feet and led them back to the stable. He gave them a bag with bread, cheese, and dried meat from the soldiers' rations. He filled a canteen with water and pressed it into Maria's hands. Then he pointed toward the forest, away from the main road, and described a path that would take them to a village where he believed they might find help. He made her repeat the directions back to him until he was satisfied she understood. Before they left, he went to the gray mare's stall. He stroked the horse's neck and spoke to her softly, as if apologizing. Then he returned to Maria and said something that sounded like a blessing or a prayer. He touched Anna's head gently, and the child looked up at him without fear. In that moment, they weren't soldier and fugitive, German and Pole, enemy and enemy. They were simply two parents trying to protect children in a world gone mad. Maria wanted to thank him, to say something that could possibly express what his mercy meant, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she took his hand and squeezed it once, hard, then turned and walked into the darkness with Anna in her arms. Behind them, she heard the young soldier return to his camp, heard him call out to his companion who was returning from investigating the disturbance. The forest swallowed them whole. Maria followed the path the soldier had described, moving slowly but steadily through the winter night. Anna was light in her arms, too light, but she was alive and that was everything. The bread and water would sustain them for a few days, long enough to reach the village, long enough to find new shelter. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, Maria looked back one final time at the estate. She could just make out the stable in the distance, could imagine the horses waking to another day, could picture the young soldier tending to them with gentle hands. She wondered if he would face consequences for letting them go, if his older companion suspected what had happened, if the gray mare would remember the woman who had kept her alive through the darkest weeks. But mostly she wondered about the capacity for goodness that could survive even in the heart of war. A German soldier had saved them, had chosen compassion over duty, had seen humanity where his training had taught him to see only enemies. That single act of mercy had given them a chance, however slim, to survive long enough to see the end of this nightmare. Maria adjusted Anna in her arms and kept walking. The village was still miles away, the war was far from over, and their future remained desperately uncertain. But the horses had kept their secret, a soldier had shown them unexpected kindness, and they were still breathing. For now, in this frozen dawn, that was enough. That was everything. She would carry her daughter through the snow and the fear and the unknown, and she would keep walking until they found safety or until her legs gave out. Either way, she would not stop. She would not surrender. She would survive, because that was what mothers did. They survived, and they kept their children alive, no matter what it cost. The forest path stretched ahead, winding through snow-laden trees toward a horizon she couldn't see. Maria took a deep breath of the cold morning air and moved forward into whatever came next, her daughter's heartbeat steady against her chest, proof that miracles could happen even in the darkest of times.